Oui, c'est bon. Welcome everybody. It's a great joy and honor for me to introduce you Professor Cristel Porte, who is full professor of Department of Language Sciences Aix-Marselha University at the Laboratoire Parole et Langage. Her interests are in phonetics and phonology of French, intonation, phonology, semantic and pragmatic aspects of intonation, prosody in dialogue and interaction, gender and voice, French prosody, and French as a foreign language, and language teaching methodology. She's also interested in the integration of information communication technologies for education and empowerment of learners. Thank you so much for being here, Cristel, and the floor is with you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Plinio, for inviting me to contribute to the Speech Prosody Lecture series. My presentation will explore the relationship between form and meaning in intonational phonology, drawing on my research on French intonation to illustrate my points. I will begin by addressing the widely acknowledged observation that there is no one-to-one correspondence between intonation and meaning. I will then emphasize the importance of reflecting on the specificity of intonational meaning and demonstrate the advantages of integrating corpus analysis with laboratory phonology in this field of research. I will focus on the issue of variability in the relationship between form and meaning before examining the concepts of compositionality and duality of patterning. I will conclude by discussing the significance of this relationship for a linguistic approach to intonation. Let's consider the claim that there is no one-to-one mapping between intonation and meaning. This table is extracted from a figure in de Leroussari et al.'s paper on French Toby, which presents the intonational contours of French on the left, along with their various uses on the right. These uses are formulated in terms of sentence types where each configuration is used, as is often the case. Here you see two contours of the French inventory, which differ in the alignment of their final rise. L star H% has a later alignment than H star H%. And this is phonologically transcribed by the difference between the pitch accent L star and H%. Importantly, both tunes are associated with multiple meanings. For example, H star H% is associated with the sentence types statements of the obvious and counter-expectational yes-no questions. Conversely, both L star H% and H star H% are used to express information-seeking questions, showing that two distinct forms can convey the same meaning. However, it is crucial to note that these observations also holds for the lexicon. For a comprehensive discussion, I refer you to François Recanate's book Literal Meaning. For instance, the English word head may denote a part of the body, a leader, one side of a coin, or the decisive element of a linguistic constituent. Given that these four meanings share common semantic features, they constitute the polysemy of a single lexical unit. On the other hand, the phonological form by is conventionally linked to four distinct meanings that bear no semantic relation to one another. These correspond to four homophonous words, each differentiated by their orthographic transcription. In some contexts, a word may even convey the opposite of its conventional meaning, as occurs with irony. These examples also show that both the literal and the ironic interpretations can be simultaneously relevant. These facts about the lexicon do not demonstrate that it is not possible to assign any stable meaning to lexical item. Rather, they show that the four-meaning relationship of linguistic units is compatible with various kinds of contextual variations. Returning to intonation, the study of the relationship between form and meaning should benefit from concepts developed for the analysis of lexical meaning. For instance, the notion of allophony, which refers to two distinct phonetic realizations of the same form-meaning relation, or the notion of synonymy, which refers to the fact that two distinct forms share the same meaning, may be useful. Conversely, the concepts of homophony and polysemy, which I already mentioned about the lexicon, may also be relevant when a single intonational form corresponds to multiple meanings. Importantly, Carlos Cousenhoven and Bob Ladd argued that intonational meaning exhibits linguistic normacy in linguist theory of intonational meaning. This is the working hypothesis I embraced in my research on French intonation. Indeed, intonational meaning fundamentally differs from lexical meaning. Its function is not to describe the facts referred to in the utterance. The central question, therefore, is how to adequately characterize the intonational meaning of phonological stable prosodic constructs like intonational tunes. The literature highlights two main dimensions: information structure and the specification of speech acts. I will briefly illustrate these aspects using an example by Ward and Hirschberg. In languages like English, information structure is signaled by the placement in the utterance of the nuclear pitch accent. This most prominent accent indicates the part of the utterance which conveys new or important information, like the word 11 in this example. Prosodically, the accented parts of the utterance, like in the morning, indicate given less crucial information already shared by participants. More importantly for our purposes, speaker B's utterance is produced with a complex tune which conveys a specific speech act, namely the incredulity of B at having to meet A at 11 a.m. I will focus on this last dimension in the rest of this lecture. Recently, the traditional typology and description of speech acts has been accommodated in order to fully account for intonational meaning. This challenge has been addressed by commitment-based approaches to meaning developed by various semanticists drawing on the foundational work of intonational phonologists. The notion of commitment refers to the idea that speakers can express various epistemic attitudes towards the proposition conveyed by an utterance. They may express that they believe more or less, and sometimes not at all, that what the sentence says is true, possible, relevant, or desirable. Such attitudes can be conveyed by verbs like I am sure that, or by adverbs like maybe, but also by intonation. For instance, in Ward and Hirschberg's example, the fact that B will be at A's place the following day at 11 a.m. is presented by A as possible and desirable by her assertive speech act and falling tune. On the contrary, the intonation of B's response expresses that B does not believe this fact to be neither relevant nor desirable. Importantly, B's reaction also reflects her disagreement with A, namely that A has a reverse commitment. It also implicates that A should repair this disagreement in a way or another in her following turn. To account for these various dimensions of commitment, Bessade and Marandin's work on French intonation proposed three features of intonational meaning. This notion has long been identified by phonologists, though not explicitly labeled as such. In Cousenhoven's book, Gustanoven's book, the author proposes that a rise in British English signals that the speaker is not engaged towards the truth of his utterance content. This illustrates the notion of speaker commitment. In their seminal paper, P. Humbert and Hirschberg argue that a speaker chooses a particular tune to convey a particular relationship between an utterance, currently perceived beliefs of a hearer or hearers, and anticipated contribution of subsequent utterances. The green portion of this citation refers to the attribution of attitudes to the addressee, while the blue portion illustrates the call on addressee to take the turn in a certain way or not to take the turn at all. Do these three features correctly reflect the specific contribution of intonation to the meaning of an utterance, and how? In 2014, several colleagues and I designed a perception experiment to test Bessade and Marandin's commitment model of French intonation. We focalized on 4 tunes in French inventory: a falling tune, a rising tune, a rising falling one, and a rise fall, which were produced with the same utterance, with the same sentence. We analyzed the meaning of these 4 tunes using the 3 intonational meaning features. This is shown in the left portion of the figure. For example, the falling contour L*L% convey a statement which is analyzed as follows. Speaker commitment is that the speaker commits to the proposition. Attitude attribution is that the speaker anticipates no disagreement for her addressee about that proposition. And call on addressee is that the addressee adds that proposition to the interlocutor's shared knowledge by not objecting or by producing a mark of agreement like OK. In the next step, we associated a reaction to each tune. This is shown on the right of the figure. We selected a reaction of a potential addressee that reacted specifically to each intonational contour. For the falling contour, the reaction "I've got it" acknowledges that the reacting speaker has no disagreement and that the proposition can be added to the common ground. We designed a perception interpretation task. Participants first listen to a sentence accompanied by a specific tune, for example, the falling tune. Then they had to choose from the 4 proposed reactions the one that best matched the tune they had just heard. In the case of the falling tune, our hypothesis was that the appropriate choice was the response, "I've got it." Results show that 3 of the 4 target tunes were consistently associated according to the proposed hypothesis, although they were presented in isolation with the sentence content as unique context. And these results support the view that intonation contours have a core meaning on their own. However, the condition to show relevant four-meaning relationships is to appropriately characterize the specific component of intonation and meaning, for instance, in terms of Bessade and Marandin's features. Only the tune H*L%, a rise fall, was not associated with the hypothesized reaction, and I will come back to this tune later on. The previous section was dedicated to show that intonation four-meaning relationship is definable and that its consistency can be empirically demonstrated. I used experimental studies to illustrate my point. I will now briefly show that combining corpus analysis and laboratory phonology is fruitful to study the relationship between intonation and meaning. Now that corpus studies are more and more accessible thanks to new technologies, it is of great interest to extend research to less controlled data, and in particular, conversational data. However, retrieving the intonative phonological units defined by laboratory phonology in conversational data is not an obvious task. To do so, it is useful to pay attention to three main sources of confusion. The first one is the continuous prosodic variations that can be superimposed on units such as pitch range and speech rate. An example of variation in tonal register within the same speaker is shown on the right side of the slide. In the central segment of the speech turn, low turning points of the F0 curve are enhanced, and the distance between low and high turning points is widened. Intonational phrases and other units which they contain can nevertheless be identified if the difference in their acoustic characteristics compared to those of neighboring segments is acknowledged. These fluencies and the co-production of linguistic units by two different speakers, both illustrated by the second example on the slide, are other sources of confusion, which I commented on in joint work with Roxane Bertrand. It is nevertheless possible and fruitful to use corpus data to investigate intonational form-meaning relationships. Together with Leonardo Lancia, we investigated the form and meaning of the contrast between the rising tune H star H% and the rise fall H star L%, the very contour that didn't match our hypotheses in the perception experiment in section 2. We used a corpus of radio debate involving 5 speakers. About the form, our hypothesis was that the rise-fall H star L% was aligned earlier in the accented syllable than the rise H star H%, what you can see on the left panel of the figure, rather than being scaled higher in the speaker range with a steeper slope, and this is shown on the right panel. That's what we found in our corpus, and we also observed some ambiguous intermediary items in dotted lines aligned midway between the two humes. About the meaning, using extracts from the corpus, we ran a perception experiment testing the hypothesis that the rise-fall H star L% should be consistently associated by participants with the meaning label conviction and obviousness, while the rise H star H% should be paired with the label continuation. We trained half of the participants with the hypothesized association, but the other half with the reverse association. We found that all participants consistently realized the hypothesized form-meaning mappings, even when they were trained for the reverse mapping. Moreover, ambiguous items were also ambiguously interpreted. Again, these results provide strong evidence of a reliable association between form and meaning for intonation. Why is it interesting to combine corpus analysis and laboratory phonology? Corpus analysis provides privileged access to linguistic data and allows one to observe a substantial part of their variations. Moreover, it gives access to contextual environments that explain this variation, and it also sometimes allows to discover emerging or previously unnoticed uses to be included in linguistic inventories. For its part, experimentation is a device for falsifying hypotheses derived from observational data, speech corpora, but also informal observation or even native speakers' intuitions. And it crucially allows one to provide evidences in favor of causal relationships rather than correlations between the choice of a form and the interpretation of a meaning. At this stage, I hope I have convinced you that reliable form-meaning relationships exist for intonation. Now, returning to the initial question of the absence of one-to-one mapping, I will devote the following section to variability, examining how to approach this issue within the linguistic normalcy view. As it is the case for the lexicon, intonation shows polysemy in conversational uses of the tunes. To show that, I will explain two studies which I conducted together with semanticist Uwe Reile. The goal of the first study was to refine the definitions of the core meaning of several French tunes, among which the rise fall A star L%. On its part, the second study aimed at explaining the context-sensitive polysemy of this particular contour. The first study defined the meaning of the contour H star L% as evolving a precondition on the context that a negative commitment should be attributed to the addressee. The other meaning features were the speaker commitment to the proposition and the call for confirmation. More interestingly for our point here, the second study showed that it is possible to account for the many different uses of the H star L% that are listed in the table below by modeling interpretative variations using Grecian conversational implicatures. I refer you to the explanations given in the paper for further details. Another source of variability in production is what Rutger and Grice called tune text adjustment. This notion refers to the fact that the tune can change form to adapt to the text and vice versa. For example, a tune can be truncated, losing part of its pitch movement. It can be compressed and/or realigned, changing its temporal configuration to fit a smaller number of syllables or a faster pitch rate. Conversely, additional segments such as a schwa syllable can be added to the text to make more room for a complex tune. Numerous studies in various languages have documented this adjustment phenomena. Together with several colleagues, I am currently studying what happens when a schwa syllable is added to H star H% or H star L% in French. An important information is that French has a final tonic syllable. And remember that the tunes differ in their alignment, the rise being aligned later than the rise fall, as we saw earlier in section 3. Would this alignment difference be preserved by later alignment of both tunes, as shown by these figures in case of introduction of a schwa syllable? In a very preliminary production study concerning a known thousand variety of French, we observed a downward movement of F0 on the inserted schwa syllable of the rising tune and a level low F0 on the inserted schwa syllable of the rise fall. The alignment difference between the two tunes is effectively preserved, but we observed no later realignment. This is because phrase final schwa in French is extrametrical, and the consequences seems to be that what happens on this syllable is not relevant intonationally. We therefore propose that this drop in F0 for H star H% is not phonological and can't be annotated as L%. Another aspect of variability that has been discussed extensively in previous lectures in this series is variability in interpretation. This may be due to contact between languages or between varieties of the same languages, which occurs among multilingual people. I studied such a variability together with James German. Corsican French people who live in Corsica are exposed to the Corsican language, which is a variety of Italian. The regional variety of French in Corsica is influenced by Corsican. In addition, these speakers are also heavily exposed to French from mainland France through the media or their stays on the continent. Excuse me. One consequence of this regional bilingualism is that the contour LH plus downstep H star L%, a rise fall aligned on the penultimate syllable, is ambiguous for these speakers. Indeed, this tune does not have the same meaning in Corsican French, where it conveys a question, and in continental French, where it conveys an assertion. In our studies, we showed that Corsican listeners tended to interpret this tune as a question when implicitly exposed to the concept of Corsica, or as a statement when implicitly exposed to the concept of Paris. This was not the case for non-Corsican participants, and this difference shows that phonological representations of intonation are context-sensitive and depend on the degree of exposure to a linguistic variety. This can be modeled using an exemplar approach to phonology. What we were unable to decide regarding the Corsican participants was whether this tune was part of a single inventory for French, as shown on the left in the figure, or whether the Corsicans had to separate inventories for the varieties of French shown on the right. In the first case, the tune is polysemous depending on the regional context, and in the second case, there is homophony between two different tunes. Other characteristics of the listener have been shown to impact the interpretation of intonation, like gender, age, or cognitive dispositions such as empathy or autistic traits. For more information on this, please refer to the lectures by Amalia Arvaniti and Simone Verle in this series. So far, I have shown how to study the variability of the form-meaning relationship of intonation without giving up on identifying stable meanings for tunes, both in corpus analysis and in laboratory experiments. Now, I propose to examine whether we can further Now I propose to examine whether we can go further by examining whether the concepts of compositionality and duality of patterning are relevant to intonational form-meaning relationship. According to philosopher Gottlob Frege, compositionality refers to the fact that the meaning of a complex expression is a function of the meaning of its constituent expressions and of the rules used to combine them. What I would like to emphasize in this section is that the contribution of prosody to utterance meaning depends on two factors: how the notion of prosodic form and the dimensions of meaning are conceptualized, and how the interface between prosody and morph syntax is conceived. Indeed, there are different ways of understanding the meaning of intonation, and all of them have their own merits and potential for discovery. Some approaches establish a direct link between acoustic phonetic parameters and communicative functions. In this case, the concept of compositionality is irrelevant, at least for intonational meaning. This approach is illustrated, for instance, by Yishu's penta model and by the conception of prosody as a set of contextualization cues proposed in some interactional approaches like those of John Locke or Bill Wells. In constructional and tune theories, compositionality is relevant between the tune, conceived as a morpheme, and other grammatical units such as the sentence. Such an approach is found in Marandin's contour as constructions theory, or in Gussonoven's and Ladd's work on these matters. A third approach relies on internal analysis of the intonation contour to concede that compositional properties apply between parts of the tune. In the aforementioned paper by Pierhumbert and Hirschberg, each tone is a morpheme. Therefore, intonation does not exhibit duality of patterning. Conversely, Steedman proposes that intonation consists of meaningless units, namely tones, that combine to form meaningful units, namely pitch accents and boundary tones. This is duality of patterning. For an in-depth discussion of this concept of duality of patterning, I recommend Bob Ladd's book, Simultaneous Structures in Phonology, which devotes a chapter to it. Inspired by Steedman's view, the semanticist Claire Bessade and I tentatively proposed a compositional semantics for French intonation, which I revisited recently. I won't go into the details, but I would just like to emphasize a few points. In both models, pitch accents vary along a unique dimension of meaning, which is agreement-disagreement in the first model, and contrast in the second model. Boundary tones indicate speaker commitment, if it is L%, and attribution of commitment to the addressee if it is 8%. Call on addressee is no longer a semantic feature, but is inferred from the other two features and from the context. Excuse me. An interesting property of these two models is that progressive alignment differences between pitch accents conveys degrees in disagreement or contrast, raising interesting issues about the relationship between continuity and discreteness in intonational phonology. These abstract and speculative works are interesting in that they allow us to reflect on the organization of contrasts within the coherent linguistic system that the tunes of a language should form. I will conclude this section with some remarks about the importance of the granularity adopted in the study of intonational meaning. The more prosody is formally structured, that is, has a detailed phonology, the more compositionality is at issue, and the more relevant it is to conceive detailed semantic components of intonation. Another crucial questions concern the types of content that are combined with intonational meanings to form the meaning of an utterance. In most studies, intonational meanings is combined with a proposition or parts of it. But it can also be combined with presuppositions and implicatures of the utterance in its context, as shown by Trunkenbrot. More importantly, intonational meaning can combine with other types of sentence meanings, such as those defined by Ginsberg and Sag, namely questions for interrogatives, outcomes for imperatives, and facts for exclamatives. These aspects have been little studied and constitute an important area of research for the future. It's time to conclude, and I will do so by emphasizing the importance of the relationship between form and meaning in linguistic research. I would first like to emphasize the importance of the interface between phonology, semantics, and pragmatics, and of interdisciplinary collaboration in order to make progress on these issues. For further information, you can consult several recent literature reviews, the references for which are provided on this slide. The contribution of prosody to meaning is a multi-faced issue, and I obviously did not cover all its dimensions in this lecture. On the form side, research must account for the role of phonological units, but also for gradual phonetic variations and fine phonetic details. Apart from nuclear pitch configurations, which are the most studied, several pioneering studies have shown that pre-nuclear regions could also play a role in providing early clues about the immediately following tune. On the mimic side, it is crucial to precisely define the relevant aspects or features of intonational meaning. I mentioned epistemicity, dialogue negotiation, evidentiality, but other aspects may be important, like, for instance, mirativity, which refers to the unexpectedness of the utterance content. All these reflect in communicative intentions of the speaker. But what about non-intonational informations conveyed by intonation, like indexical or emotional ones? Many interesting dimensions remain to be explored. Finally, I borrow this figure from Kangemi and Grice, which shows the importance of combining the analysis of meaning with the study of substance and form for a complete linguistic investigation of intonation. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to the key contributors with whom I have the privilege of working. The references cited in this lecture are listed in the last 4 slides. And here they are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cristel. Now it's time for questions. Thank you so much for this very well and synthesized presentation of such a difficult issue of intonational meaning and so many dimensions you work on, show us today. Now it's time for questions. Normally people ask questions here on YouTube. I'll wait a little bit to people to write down their questions there, and if so, I will read them to you, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great thing to combine corpus analysis and laboratory phonology accounts, controlling laboratory and look at corpora of spontaneous speech in different situations is a very great thing to do nowadays. I think you know that the work by Emanuela Cresti from Italy, probably, that works with spontaneous speech, and they have a very good corpus on several languages on their web pages, and they do a lot of work using the relation between prosody and pragmatics with this corpora. The case in Brazil, they have a corpora with in different situations, even in soccer games and people buying things in stores, things like that. Is very rich as a corpus, and it's great to combine controlled speech and corpus analysis for the studies, particularly of intonation and other aspects of prosody. Do you know about, do you have something to say about duration? If you have to look at duration, this particular context, I mean, particularly in in contexts where you manipulate. I remember the case of the schwa syllable after the tonic syllable. Do you try to manipulate to look at longer durations in these examples you presented to us? I mean, the
Not
role
yet.
of duration. Not yet?
No, not yet. No. No, this question of schwa in French is very special, because what is assumed in the literature is rather that when you add a schwa syllables, it can help complex intonation tunes to have more room to be realized, and not truncated, for instance. But in French, as you saw on the slide, it's not the case at all, actually.
Not the case. Then it seems that you should focus on the tonic syllable, and if the tonic syllable already has a contrast, it's enough to have that. You don't need a lot of additional ones. It seems the case.
Yeah, so it's also interesting, this question in French, because some authors proposed or assumed that French is a boundary language and has no pitch accent. If this were the case, the hypothesis would be that the intonational tune, the rise or the rise fall, would be realigned on the schwa syllable when a schwa syllable is added. And actually, it's not what happens. So this is a strong evidence to prove that actually French has pitch accent.
Yes, I hope so.
The last two syllables.
Because it's not saying that the language don't have a way to use prominence in other positions in the it's a bit strange. And French has a lot of initial prominence as well. Accent d'insistance, several ways of marking prominence throughout the utterance, isn't it?
Yes, it is the case, actually. I didn't speak about the initial rise in my presentation because I focused on final tunes. But the initial rise is very often used, for instance, in information structure to mark the left boundary of the focused constituent, for instance. Yeah, but I didn't speak about intonation, about information structure in my talk, so.
Okay, no, it's 45 minutes. It's not time enough to do everything. I understand completely. And do you have? I don't know if in your set of corporate, if you have different speaking styles, if you try to found differences according to differences in speaking style. For instance, broadcasts, teachers doing classes, different speaking styles, to see if you could find more examples of polyphony and homophony that you presented to us. Did you have that in your corpora?
I didn't really explore these differences, but I had the occasion to work on different styles. For instance, the work with Leonardo Lancia on the rise fall and the simple rise, this contrast was on radio debate, where the speakers were journalists and political persons, politicians. So the people used to rhetorical speech
Yeah.
So the way they used intonation was very varied and informed. I mean, not by research, but by practice, I will say.
Understood.
And the other work with Uwe Reiler on the polysemy of the rise fall was on another corpus, which is the corpus of interactional data, which has been proposed by Roxane Bertrand and Beatriz Priego Valverde, which is a spontaneous conversation recorded in the lab.
Okay.
And here, of course, there are some differences. For instance, sentences are shorter. There are much more, turns are shorter also. There are much more back channels.
Yeah.
And what else? Yeah, and so, yeah, the interactional aspects are much more visible.
Yeah, of course.
But I didn't compare the two corpora, so I won't be able to comment on the differences more than that.
Okay, no
more
problem.
Than formally.
We have two questions from the YouTube. The first one is from Salvatore Giannino. Thank you for the great talk. I saw that you attribute both the contrast and agreement dimensions to pitch accents. Do you see them as parallel and independent features, or they are intertwined?
Yeah. Actually, the first model of the semantics of French tunes we proposed with Claire Bessade defined disagreement as the relevant term for the pitch accent choice. But when I reworked on the model on my own later on, I reflected that this dimension of disagreement is included actually in the notion of contrast, which is broader. And since some contours like the rise fall is also used to mark focus, so contrastive focus, it was better to replace contrast agreement disagreement by contrast including agreement disagreement. That's the point.
Great.
Good question. Thank you, Salvatore.
We have another one by Stella Griglia from the Netherlands. Thank you for the great talk. You discussed the compositionality and the relationship between intonation and semantics pragmatics. Where do you place syntax?
Can you repeat, please? I didn't understood the
fact. Where do you place syntax? You discussed compositionality and the relationship between intonation and semantics and pragmatics. Where do you place syntax?
Syntax. Yeah.
Syntax.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I actually I can't exactly answer precisely to this question. I look at syntax in relation to intonation on information structure in French, because information structure in French uses some syntactic construction to mark focus and topicality. Okay, so I looked at the way intonation was related to these contractions in different information structures. But in general, I didn't look at the different forms, syntactic forms of speech acts, for instance. But of course, it is very important too. Even if my guess would be that, at least for French, most of the time, the relevant informative part of the tune, the nuclear pitch accent, would be placed at the end of the syntactic construction. But this is to be verified empirically. I can't be assertive on this question. But thank you for the very, very important question.
Thank you. I don't see other questions here for the time being. I think when you go to spontaneous corpora, the question of syntax is much more complicated because you have a lot of paratags, isn't it? A lot of different forms that are different generalized syntactically, don't you think? At least in the corpus, I told you, there are a lot of how can I say, utterance that doesn't have verbs, utterance that are incomplete in spontaneous conversations as well.
I would assume that this is not a problem, in that these sentences without a verb actually semantically contain the whole proposition.
Yeah.
Generally, you have to search for the complement of the proposition in the context, in the preceding sentence, for instance. And so I would consider these sentences as utterances in their own. And so the intonational information would be, for French at least, also on the final syllable, most of the time at the end of these short sentences. So, yeah. But of course, depending on your syntactic theory, this can be very controversial. But yeah, we had a project with Roxane Bertrand to look at what happens to intonation when there are disfluencies, what happens at the boundary of sentences when there is a disfluence after the sentence, but also what happens within the sentence, what happens to intonation on the prenuclear accents, for instance, when there is differences inside the sentence. Yeah, this is very important and interesting. And for instance, in some approaches which just look at the surface prosody and don't assume that there is a deep form for intonation, the prosodic realization of disfluency will be considered as a unit. And I'm not sure this is the good analysis, for instance. I would assume that intonational units would be interrupted as textual units are. And so that what happens prosodically in this place is special and should be analyzed on a separate line.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Both Salvatore and Stella thanked you for your replies, for your response to them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cristel. It's 5 to 2 p.m. here in Brazil. I think it's time to end your lecture and the presentation. Thank you so much again, Cristel, for being here and for giving this lecture to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Plinio. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all. I will stop the transmission now. Okay, end it. YouTube is
Good.
not